I'm me and you're you, and this is the NU Digital Classroom, Chapter 3, Part 2. Welcome. Hope you're doing well. Okay, so welcome back. It's kind of, you might find it interesting. I did the Part 1 for this, and then I did that Monday or Tuesday. And then with Conestoga, my real heavy teaching days are Wednesday, Thursday, so I teach like a 3-hour class twice on Wednesday and twice on Thursday. So in between the last video and this video, I've got like 12 hours of practice now standing up teaching. But the first time I did it was in that video last time, so I got a little bit of a better setup process going now, so hopefully this should be pretty smooth. You know, we're learning as we're going. Motor development, I'm focusing on my motor development here. It's like there is something to be said about just being physically active and moving, and think of what motor development means. This idea that as the baby starts to move, that actually, well, it's the development of their motor skills, their motor, their motion, that newborns have a range of reflexes. Now, if you want to add to your notes, the interesting thing about a reflex is that it's an unlearned behavior, right? Like the baby, and this is like a hack, if you're a parent and you're trying to get your baby to take, if I'm trying to get Charlotte to take the soother, and you take the soother and you just touch to the side of their mouth and they sort of turn to it, right? Or if you touch your finger into the middle of their hand and they close around it. It's like those are reflexes, those are behaviors, but those aren't taught behaviors. Those are unlearned behaviors, reflexes, these reactions to stimulus that govern the early movements of the baby. And that these reflexes allow infants to respond adaptively to their environment. Like, think of how last week we were spending a lot of time with, or last time, this idea of how evolutionary and developmental psychology are sort of two sides of the same coin, and that this gift of our biology is this ability to do certain behaviors that help us survive without needing to learn in traditional ways we would understand as learning. Reflexes allow infants to respond adaptively to their environment before they've had an opportunity to learn. Like the rooting reflex is what I was explaining there with the soother. Right, and that the idea here is that babies that did that, and again, this translates way beyond just humans, that animals born in the wild that are able to nurse and latch to the nipple of mom and actually get nourishment are more likely to survive. And that's happened millions and millions and millions and millions and millions of times. So much so that it almost gets hardwired into this behavioral reflex, this unlearned behavior. But it's hard to even use the word behavior because behavior almost implies a learned thing. I'll pull back that because there's obviously also unconscious influences on behavior, but again, it's for your note, the point to have is that reflexes are unlearned behaviors, but that are directly results of evolution and that are linked to increasing survival chances. All right, part 2, here we go. This is having a blast already. Sorry, I got some of my notes on like a little tablet there that just was bright light straight to the camera, but so if you're wondering why I'm so uplit from the bottom. All right, next slide. So I have here for you, and you don't have to write this down, it's just sort of interesting, right? That like how you can see something. So let's take an example of rooting, the example I was using with the soother, right? That the baby, the cheek stroke or the side of the mouth is touched. That's the type of stimulation. The infant's response is to turn head, open mouth, begin to feed. Then that disappears after about 3 to 4 months. Now, the idea is that by 3 or 4 months, like the baby's learned it then. That instinct, that reflex. It's interesting, this instinctive reflex, you could almost say, right? And like the difference between the words instinct and reflex is an interesting question too. So all these things, whether we're talking about blinking, right? And so now think about, and then the right side of the column is interesting too, because it's looking at this developmental pattern. So for example, if you clap, you shouldn't probably do this, but if you clap really loud right in front of a baby's face, it's going to close its eyes and react in a startled way. But my 5-year-old would react that way probably too, especially if it was unexpected. And you might react like that too if it was totally unexpected and someone from like behind you clapped in front of your face, reached their hands in front, clap really loud. It's like your natural reaction is going to be to pull back and close your eyes. Probably headbutt the person that did it, because you're just naturally going to draw away from the sound, right? Because the developmental pattern is that it's permanent. So the reason for going on that rant is to say something like that blink response is something you were born with, didn't have to be taught it, and you still do as an adult. Now, most of these on this list are going to be disappearing within the first couple months. Pretty interesting, eh? So instead of just reading these all to you, because I'm sure your eyes have probably been reading it a bit as I've been talking here, but the point I want to just keep stressing is unlearned behavior. Reflexes are unlearned behaviors, which ask a whole lot of interesting genetic, biological questions, because what the heck is an unlearned behavior? Okay, so for this next story, if you could just sort of, what I'm going to do is, and you know this, I don't even need to say this, is what I'll basically have is the points for your notes on the screen, and then I'm going to tell this story around this idea of like, so earlier in the course we talked about, and I've mentioned a couple times, this guy named Arnold Giselle, and or maybe I haven't kind of laid him out specifically. The last name is Gessell, Gessell, Giselle. And so he's like a big name in the genetic aspect or history of psychology. Developmentalist Aaron Giselle, so this is in 1934, discovered that infants and children develop rolling, sitting, standing, all these motor skills that we're looking at the last slide, in what seems to be this fixed order and within specific time frames. So think about that for a sec, because remember, you have to put yourself in the mind frame of this is almost 100 years ago. So he's writing this in 1934. He's arguing that these things that we're talking about seem to be unfolding in some kind of plan, right? Like he's trying to explain why those things, like why do babies seem to do that? Why do they tend to close on the finger? Why do they have this regular reaction if you touch the bottom of their foot? Giselle argued that the motor development comes through this unfolding of a genetic plan, emphasizing nature rather than nurture. Giselle's observations were painstaking, but we now know that the sequential of developmental milestones is not as fixed as he initially thought. Right, so it's like he was definitely onto this idea that there's this underlying genetic plan is how we would now call it, but he called it the sequenced plan. Like you do this, then you do this, then you do this. More recent theorists emphasize function adaptive value of motor behavior, like this idea that it's not just that you're like pre-programmed to learn things at certain stages. It's that as you're a baby, you're triggered by your environment to do certain things, like reach for certain things or turn certain ways, and that to view it all as pre-programmed behavioral reactions is ignoring how much of it is environmental influence. And again, it's like this age-old nature-nurture. It's obviously some kind of combination. Right, but this environment argument is saying that a baby's maybe learning to crawl because they're seeing an exciting new toy and they're feeling motivated to reach it. Whereas within the dynamic system idea of Giselle, he's more saying, well, he's trying to explain this idea of why does it, okay, so if it's just the environment, then why don't we see differences in kids in different environments? Why is there this commonality? Why is there this reliable, again, remember, we're not using the terms genetic quite yet, but what we could only call this like genetic programming that seems to be related to the idea that behaviors are getting passed through genetics, right? So like fields like behavioral genetics are nowhere near existing yet at this stage, but you can see the early glimpses of those ideas. According to Giselle's theory, and I have this as like the second point there, perception and action are coupled. That's actually a pretty deep point. I don't know why I don't have any of that blue, but So think about this idea of, just think about how deep that is. That it's not like you're going through the world and acting and then perceiving it and being like, oh, this is my experience and this is my interpretation of my experience, and oh, it's so interesting how I go through my world and talk to people and have an experience in behavior, but then also have a perception of it. He's like saying like that's like maybe if we're making a movie and we're showing the person's dialogue in as their thoughts and we're trying to like do a Hollywood show. It's like in the real life, your perception of the world is right up at the level of sensation. Right, Merleau-Ponty wrote a book back in the day called The Primacy of Perception. It's basically making this argument that like perception is all the way up at sensation. You don't like, and what that's basically saying is like your sensory organs is your sensation, right? So it's like your eyes, your ears, you're hearing things, you're hearing me talk, and then you're judging what you're hearing and making sense of it and interpreting it. But that interpretation's like right up at the, there's not a huge gap there. Perception and action, or action could be cognitive action or behavioral action. Perception and action are coupled. And for the baby, perception and motor action are coupled. In order to develop motor skill, infants must perceive something in their environment that motivates them to act, and then use their perceptions to fine-tune their movements. Oh, that's the rattle that's making that noise, and I want that. And so to get, but when I hit it with this side of my hand, I can't. And so the idea is that like this idea that eventually, if you can't see me, that description made no sense, but I was like kind of trying to show a baby learning how to actually grab something, right? Which now is just like such an easy skill. But the idea is that's actually what we would call fine motor skills, and that's actually hard. It's a lot easier to swing your arm than it is to grab something, and you all know that. But this is where there's really interesting links between child development and artificial intelligence, because a lot of things that babies struggle to do are also things that people in fields like robotics and artificial intelligence are struggling with getting machines to do. And you start to realize this interesting thing, that things that you assume are easy, like the fact that when you want to pick up my, say I got my phone sitting there, if I just want to pick up my phone, that I just sort of like, without even thinking about it, sort of look at my arm, like almost shoots there. It's like so much of, if like you just heard a sound behind you, it's like you look, you've done that look. It's like the amount of stuff we do that's not actually triggered by a thought to do it first, but that we might explain why we did it, but we did it, right? And this, I don't know, I'm just sort of blown away by the complexity of words that we use every day, but that are actually pretty complicated, like what coordination is, what eye-hand connection is, how you can train someone with baseball. Okay, here's an example. Me and my wife play ping pong, right? So we got a ping pong table in the garage, and like we'll play ping pong. I can take a ping pong ball, so say it's like she got the point, but it's because it went out on my side, I missed it or whatever. So I'm gonna hit the ball back to her because it's her serve. I can blast it. So like if I have it like this, we've practiced it. So like I'm pretty good at, like, if she has her hand like this, I'll put it right in her hand, wham, like hard, fast, boom, and she'll catch it. It's like, it's a very specific skill, but it's because we've done that so many times, and it's like the biomechanics of that are fascinating. And you'd be able to do it too, right? It's like any sport. It's what we just call it eye-hand coordination or whatever, but it's like, what does that mean? The ability for your eye to notice something, immediately recognize what it's noticing, and create this heavily myelinized connection. We used that word last time. This wired, heavily solidified connection. Alright, I'm getting a little rambly, eh? In this theory, the new behavior is the result of many converging factors: the development of the nervous system, the body's physical properties and possibilities for movement, the goal the child's motivated to reach, so psychology, and also the environmental supports for the skill. Okay, minor adjustment here. I switched the mic to this side now because I think, again, by the time it's like I'm probably gonna go back to teaching in person at my kitchen job in the winter. It's like right when I finally have my setup perfect, but it's been a long road trying to learn how to like make videos and stuff. So if anyone's ever run into any tech issues at all, like I can help you a bit, because especially if you're on PCs, on Macs, I'd have to Google it a bit, but so much of it's just trial and error, right? Just having tried things and having tons of things not work and some things work, and you know, for example, realizing that it's, even though it would maybe be a little smoother presentation wise to kind of go point by point and how it comes up on the screen, that like if you don't have all your points up and you finish your thing and then you press end to record, but there's a last point, then it messes up your timing, and you usually don't catch that until you're like trying to upload your video, and just all these little things, right? So it's good to train and it's good to upgrade, and then your visual, I don't know how I'm going to link this. I tried to just force a segue there, but okay, so on the last slide, we were talking about this idea of perception, and I was making this point of like the primacy of perception, and this idea of perception being all the way up at the point of sensation, and what's sensation, and if you can have that idea that sensations, when information interacts with our sensory receptors in the most definitional way, it's when you respond to things, when your sensory receptors, if you were a machine we built that had receptors on it to notice, to receive, to be receptive to certain things, and it started to like blink and stuff, it's like you're getting sensation. It's like your sensory system, your eyes, your ears, your tongue, your nostrils, your skin, a newborn's baby. I'm going to look at this idea of how the sensory system of the infant from a visual perspective, and how quickly their eyesight improves, and how that's really linked to this myelination idea that we talked about earlier. And it seems like it's like highly prioritized, right? So like by a couple months, the baby has highly complex vision, especially if you're comparing it to like auditory, which takes years to develop. For your notes, I should have said months instead of years for auditory. Yeah, but we're going to look at some of this stuff, right? That like your auditory system takes longer to kind of reach its end state of completion than your eyes do. And I was talking about that the other day when I was saying about how the cephalocodal idea, right? That the baby's able to use the eyes before lower parts of even the face, that there seems to be this preference process going on that's really focused on brain, eyes. And at a certain point, you see in the picture there the optic nerve. The optic nerve basically is the brain reaching into the eye. The brain's the eye. It's sort of just depending on your definition, right? Like it's a tool of the brain that is intimately connected to the brain through the optic nerve, which you can see there is the pink, which literally reaches into the eye. You can see the optic nerve coming up. The retina actually kind of reaches back into it. So it's like, now, I think I made this point to you the other day that Darwin, when he was coming up with his ideas around evolution, like he was having nightmares about the eye. How could that evolve? That was so complex. It's just an interesting idea that the person that came up with the idea of evolution had nightmares about the eye. Sensation occurs when information interacts with the sensory receptors, the eyes, the ears, tongue, nostrils, skin. The sensation of hearing occurs when the waves pulsating through the air are collected by our outer ear and transmitted through the bones of the inner ear to the auditory nerve. The sensation of vision occurs as rays of light contact the eye, become focused on the retina, as in that picture, and are transmitted by the optic nerve to the visual centers of the brain. So it's your physical receptors engagement with the outside world, then that's interpreted by you, and we call that interpretation by you your perception. Your perception is the interpretation of what is sensed. The airwaves that contact the ears might be interpreted as noise or as music. The physical energy transmitted to the retina might be interpreted as a color, a pattern, a shape, depending on how it's perceived, an angle. And well, angle is a good example of how light is interpreted. Perception brings us into contact with the environment in order to interact with it and adapt to it. I'll read that sentence again because that's decent. Perception brings us into contact with our environment so that you can interact and adapt with it. It's almost like this idea, if you were walking around just with sensation, you'd be like a closed system. You'd just be like, you'd be just that machine blinking and signaling that it's receiving things. There's a crack in the floor there that I need to avoid. This little live change, I should have done this in between slides. Yeah, but like right here, you can hear if I like shift my, and I got the dad like constant rocking of trying. I try not to do it when I'm doing the teaching if I catch myself in the little video at the bottom, but and there's a part of me that every time I go on those side rants, I want to be like, oh, I should start that slide over and keep these like totally crisp, but I'm also just trying to be real with you. All you North Bay students are awesome. All my Kitchener students are awesome. North Bay and Kitchener, interesting. I ended up teaching those two groups, and it's like, I've already made this rant that I love the North, going up north. And yeah, I've been the Kitchener lifer. So, but anyways, all that was because of the floor, because my sensation, that's my connection, my sensation of the floor making that sound was creating this stress response in my perceptual system and like interfering with my perceptual system's ability to keep its attention focused on the sensation. I don't know, I'm trying to make a link. But anyways, perception is this interpretation of those senses. Perception is the interpretation of what is sensed. Perception is designed for action. Okay, so think about that for a sec. That's a good point to have in your note. Perception is designed for action. It's this idea that you're not just in a world. You're in a world and you're adapting and reading it and doing things based on those readings. You have agency. It gives people information such as when to duck or when to turn their body as they move through a narrow passageway or when to put their hands up to catch something. Perception is designed for action. Okay, so habituation. So to explain this word, a good way to talk about it is this scarecrow example, right? The crows are in the cornfield, so the farmer puts a scarecrow in the cornfield to scare them away, and it works for a bit until the crows start to just become normalized to that scarecrow's presence. It's like this new initially scary stimulus is no longer being perceived as scary by the visual system. And now all of a sudden in the third picture, the crows are actually like right on top of the scarecrow, right? Because they've integrated it into their visual system. And so researchers are interested in this with really small children, right? Like if you show a baby a certain doll a bunch of times and then you show it that doll again but with other dolls, will it have any kind of visual preference for the doll that's been shown before? So like what role does familiarity play? And it's interesting if they don't show any kind of preference, right? So if they don't look more at that one doll. Okay, so think about that for a sec. So say we show the baby this doll a bunch of times, and the next day we come back and we show it 4 dolls, and one of them is the one we showed already, and we're wanting to notice, like, does she look any more at the one that she's sort of been primed to look at? And if she doesn't, that there's sort of 2 broad ways that developmental psychologists have tried to explain that failure of visual preference. And one is either that the baby's not distinguishing between them, and the second is that they're not actually preferring one over the other, despite the fact that they can tell it apart, right? So if you were to like say theoretically, what could that mean? The baby doesn't spend any different time looking at the one she's already seen. Either she doesn't realize she's already seen it, or she just doesn't care. And that's actually 2 different things. And even with a little baby, it could be that they don't care. Because maybe to them, they're not A doll's a doll is a doll still. So one is that the first explanation for why they didn't notice or spend extra time looking at the doll they'd already seen is that they're not discriminating between the dolls. They're not noticing that one they've seen and the others they haven't. The other explanation is that they actually don't prefer one over the other, despite the fact that they can tell them apart. So to measure discrimination in visual perception, right? So like picking one thing. So our visual system is discriminating constantly between what are things we should be looking at and what are just background things. It's constantly doing that. It's this constant, what matters in the environment, focus on that, ignore peripheral. That's the core function of the system. So to measure this discrimination process, and I know discrimination is used in a different way usually, right? But in this sense, we're using the word discrimination to mean picking certain visual stimulus over other. So to measure that, researchers use this habituation paradigm. During a habituation, or what I've been kind of calling a familiarization phase, showing the baby the thing in advance, the doll, a stimulus such as a sight or sound or doll is presented a number of times until the infant decreases its response, right? So like I show the baby a doll, she's like, oh cool, doll. Show it again, she's like, oh cool, the doll. So I show it like 4 or 5 times. Eventually she's like bored with it basically. Okay, so we'd say, okay, that's the familiarization phase complete. Once the baby's bored, familiarization phase complete. Next, habituation indicates that the baby has no longer had interest in the stimulus. If the researcher now presents a new stimulus and the infant can discriminate it from the habituation stimulus, the infant's response will come back, right? So if I was to say, so say she's initially happy, bored. Now I have a different toy that initially made her happy, and I show them back, and she's happy again. We would think that she's happy again because she's noticed that this is a new thing. Even though what I was just doing was making her bored, it's new. She's not habituation, habitat where you live, what's familiar. It's not familiar. It's this novelty principle. The recovery of the habituated response, that like being excited to see a doll, in stimulation is called dishabituation, right? So like becoming not normal again or not familiar again. Habituation means habitat means where you live, right? It's like what's normal, what's your accepted psychological framework, interpretive way of seeing the world. And it's like this baby's getting bored because it's familiar. Now something new, it's like a stimulation, a new novelty, and it creates this recovery of the habituated response, right? So the habituated response was that the baby was starting to get bored. It's a kind of complicated idea, and I hope I explained that decent and it made sense, that baby example. But the idea is that, and you see, like I notice it even with my daughter, that sometimes she'll look like right at me and we'll have an exchange because now she's about 9 weeks. So like now she'll start to like look at me and I can make her laugh a bit, but there's definitely still times where it's like I'm wondering like what she's looking at, and she's mainly attracted visually to novelty, to newness. And it's so interesting that your brain's designed to do that, and you even do that now, right? It's like my wife's like borderline expert at that. It's like if we walk into the house and there's like a blanket sitting on the couch that wasn't there, she's like, how come that blanket's up there? It's like, how did you notice that immediately? It's like it's a visual processing thing. It's because she just did notice it, and it's because of, well, if you're just viewing what's happening from a visual processing of sensation perspective, it's an example of this habituation dishabituation effect. So if you want to add to your note acuity, so it just means kind of like how clear, right? So like you can kind of see in these pictures that as you move across towards the right or whatever, that it's getting more clear. And so you would say also that the visual acuity is increasing. The 4 photographs represent a computer estimation of what a picture of a face looks like to a 1-month-old, 2-month-old, 3-month-old, and then a year-old. So you can kind of see, right? Like at 1 month, very blurry. At 2 months, though, so now the baby's starting to get to the point where, because really early on, it's basically mom and then everybody else. And then that starts, the people in the immediate social circle start to crack in a little bit. And you can kind of think of it as sort of happening around that 2, and especially as you get to 3 months. By the time you get to the year, the baby's vision is pretty close to yours. Which is incredible, really. But again, goes to, sorry if I know if I bumped this, it probably sounds terrible, but this similarity to you is this idea of like, or the point I was making about that is like, it's interesting how much it's prioritizing this visual development. It's happening so fast. Right, by like 3 months, it's not clear, but it's distinguishable from, like, say that's mom, and say mom has a sister that looks sort of the same. That's probably clear enough that you could tell the difference. Or let's use dad and uncle as the example, because if it's mom, it's a more complicated example, because babies for some reason seem to be able to identify mom at a level where that's earlier than that, and mom and baby have all kinds of connections like that that are difficult to explain science-wise, like how a mother can hear a baby's cry at a level that doesn't make sense that they can hear that quiet. Again, evolution in nature is an interesting thing, and a foolish thing to assume we have complete knowledge over the complexity of it. So you may have heard of this idea of a visual cliff experiment before, and because in a lot of intro psych classes they might show this if they're talking about how vision works, and especially how depth perception works. But it fits here in the history of developmental psych and looking at infancy. So I just want to potentially revisit it with you for a sec. And so this is Eleanor Gibson and Richard Walk in 1960, and they constructed this idea called the visual cliff. They did this by creating 2 levels of this checkerboard. You're looking at it on the screen there. 2 levels of this checkerboard pattern, one height at the height of a table and the other at the height of a floor. Of the floor, right? So one's basically, my hands are totally wrong. So like basically waist height and ground. The drop-off was covered by glass so that it was safe for babies to crawl over the visual cliff. They placed 6 to 12-month-olds. Okay, so in the study, the kids that they used ranged from half a year to a year old. They placed them on the edge of the cliff, sort of like that child there, and had their mothers try to coax them or encourage them, come here, to crawl over the glass. Most of the infants wouldn't crawl on the glass, choosing to stay on the safe side. Right, so the researchers took this as an indication that so most of the kids wouldn't do it. They're not going to do it. And the researchers are saying, okay, well, it's because they can tell once they get closer to a year old that if they were to do that, they would fall. It's a visual thing. They're visually noting it. So I'm going to show you some challenges to this idea in a sec, okay? But this is basically the idea that the reason why when you set a baby there and you get mom to go on the other side and basically just say, come here, and the baby shows hesitancy, that hesitancy is because of a visual recognition of depth that's scaring them. Most of the infants wouldn't crawl across the glass, choosing to stay on the safe side. Now, some recent work shows that this fear of height is also influenced by motor experience, and they did this experiment now on 7-month-olds who had not yet started to crawl. And they were given, this is an interesting study, because they were given training in these baby go-karts and provided experiences in self-motion. When placed on the visual cliff, babies showed accelerated heart rate, an indication that they'd become wary of heights. So this is kind of interesting. It's like there seems to be this idea that kids, if you can take a baby before they can crawl and put them in a go-kart and they start to experience movement, they all of a sudden become afraid of heights, is basically what this is saying. So that movement is almost, it's maybe not visual. So think of what fundamentally the different in explanatory perspective is, trying to explain it perspective is there, right? On the one hand, I'm saying, oh, it's visual. They're looking down and seeing that there's distance and they don't want to fall. And on the other hand, I'm saying that there's this, once the baby starts to move, it engages like the physical system, which makes it aware of danger potentially, so that it's coming almost from it's basically not coming from the eyes solely. So interesting. So now keep that in mind. I'll just read this part again, so hopefully that made it a little more clear. So that babies in the experimental group were given training in this baby go-kart that provided an experience of self-powered motion. When placed on the visual cliff, these babies showed an accelerated heart rate that got agitated, an indication that they'd become wary of heights. Babies in the control group were not given the experience in self-powered motion or in the go-kart, showed no evidence of that heart rate increase. This study provides evidence of the idea of perception and action working together in development. It's when babies begin to move independently that they begin to become wary of heights.
Everyone has had some kind of an experience feeling something kind of like fear of heights, and it makes perfect common sense that we shouldn't jump over the edge of a drop-off because it's dangerous, and if it's dangerous, then we should probably be afraid of it.
Probably. Exactly how and when this hypothetical fear develops makes for pretty gleeful research inside Dr. Karen Adolph's lab.
We're discovering some surprising things that are flying in the face of, how people have studied locomotion for the last 100 years.
Including what babies do and feel when they're on a ledge.
So the story about fear of heights is that there was a very, very famous classical study in developmental psychology by Gibson and Locke in 1960 that showed that human infants and infants of a number of different species will avoid crossing over an apparent drop-off on what they called a visual cliff.
As soon as the baby can move about, he can be observed in the same way as other animals.
It's a glass table, and on one side there's a checkerboard pattern surface right under the glass. The other side of the table, the pattern surface is way down on the floor. So visually, it looks like a big 3-foot drop-off. So when human babies first begin crawling, most of them will crawl over the apparent drop-off, but after several weeks of crawling experience, then they'll begin to refuse to crawl over the drop-off. And the conventional interpretation of this was that infants are avoiding the drop-off because they're afraid of heights.
She's backing away very
No, she's not interested.
She wants no part of that side.
The experiment became the shaky foundation for the myth that crawling innately teaches us to fear heights.
Babies avoid going over the drop-off because they're afraid of heights. How do we know they're afraid of heights? Because they avoid crawling over the drop-off. So as you may have noticed, the argument is circular.
As it happened, the visual cliff was a better test of an infant's depth perception, not their fear of heights. And if you look closely, you may have actually noticed that the babies don't look particularly scared.
It is a perfectly safe surface of support. So after one trial, human infants cleverly figure this out, and then they will crawl over the drop-off.
So how do you really test if a baby's scared of heights?
You can test babies at the edge of a real cliff where there's no safety glass. It's just an actual drop-off, and the drop-off can be adjustable, so it can be little or really, really big.
And why stop there? Inside Dr. Adolph's Infant Action Lab, babies are tested on a variety of apparatuses.
You can test babies at the edge of a slope, so it can be steeper, 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 crossing bridges that are wide or narrow over a surface of support, and so on. If there's no safety glass, you can test the same baby dozens and dozens of trials in the same session. And that means that you can determine for each individual infant when they think that that surface is safe and when they think it's risky within a couple of degrees of accuracy, like 2 degrees of accuracy for a slope.
Dr. Adolph has spent 25 years running tests like these, and the resulting data sets are both convincing and adorable.
Infants spend most of each trial right at the edge of the precipice. They're reaching their arm down over the drop-off. They are putting their little feet or their little hands on the bridge and taking little tiny steps at the edge. And all the while they're doing it with either neutral or positive facial expressions.
What's more surprising is how their approach changes as they learn different forms of locomotion.
So what happens is that when babies first begin crawling, they'll crawl right over the edge. Then over weeks of crawling, their responses get more and more accurate until finally they're at adult-like levels so that they can tell precisely whether a slope is safe for crawling or whether a drop-off is safe for crawling. But then the next week, when these babies stand up and face these same drop-offs, same slopes, same apparatus, now as a new walker, they walk right over the edge. So in fact, there seems to be 4 learning curves in development as babies learn to sit, learn to crawl, as they learn to cruise, and then finally as they learn to walk. So if they were afraid of heights, you should just be afraid of heights. In the rain and on a train and in a tree, you shouldn't see 4 separate learning curves.
So if babies aren't learning to be afraid of heights, what are they learning?
I think that what babies are learning over weeks of sitting, crawling, cruising, walking is they're learning to perceive the relations between their bodies and the environment.
They're discovering what's possible and what's just a little too far.
And you can learn that without feeling any sort of fear at all. In fact, Eleanor Gibson, the person who first invented the visual cliff, wrote later in her life, as a goat is peering over the edge of a steep crag, it knows not to walk off the edge. And she said, I don't think it's feeling any emotions at all. It just knows not to go. And that's what we're seeing in babies.
Who probably know not to go. Probably. For Science Friday, I'm Luke Groskin.
Within hours of birth, infants prefer to look at faces rather than other objects. Okay, I say there that, and tend to look at attractive faces more than unattractive ones. So they're noticing, they're doing this visual discrimination is the word, meaning picking one over another. The technical use of the word. Faces are possibly the most important visual stimulus in a child's social environment, and it's important that they interact, or that they, extract key information from other people's faces. Infants show this interest in people's faces immediately after birth. Within hours after they're born, research shows that an infant prefers to look at faces rather than other objects, and will prefer to look at attractive faces over unattractive faces. Like visual acuity, postnatal after birth changes in face processing are attributed to visual experiences. So the face processing, just think about that, right? Like, and I made the connection earlier between a child's mind's early stages of development and like artificial nowadays, like it's like all your phones probably have facial recognition abilities, right? Or regardless, if you go out for the day and you walk into a few stores, you've probably been exposed to facial recognition at some point. Right, the attempt to computerize that, which I'll resist the urge to rant about. So some babies, if they have bad cataracts on their eyes, bilateral cataracts, and they have those removed and they then receive their first visual input late, their face preferences are actually identical to those of newborns. So that's like kind of an interesting medical scenario where what their first visual stimulus is gets delayed because of these cataracts, and as soon as they're removed, it's like they have a day 1 experience of vision. So that's actually super important, because that's sort of saying that like it hasn't met the world yet, so it's not whatever a couple weeks developed like you might think it would be. So this is a neat idea, that it's almost like it's starting like this and tightening or narrowing, that our perceptual capacities are narrowing. This idea of perceptual narrowing, being able to focus in. This experience plays a key role in the infant's ability to tell faces apart. At 6 months of age, Babies don't recognize faces as well as adults do, but their ability to recognize faces is similar across all categories, right? They can tell, oh, these are a group of faces. This is like showing them images, and they tend to be able to notice the difference between a picture that's facing the right way or that's upside down, or between a human and a monkey, so like across species, telling the difference. And infants were shown single faces during a familiarization process like we talked about before. They then showed infants a pair of faces during a test phase. One face was novel, new, and the other one had been seen before. Both 6 and 9-month-old babies showed a novelty preference, meaning that they looked at the one they hadn't seen, the new one, providing evidence that they could tell the difference. However, only 6-month-olds showed novelty preference when tested with the monkey faces. So it's showing that distinguishing between monkey and human comes before being able to distinguish between humans within the category, which makes sense. Perceptual narrowing is adaptive. It ensures that perceptual abilities are shaped by the environment. So think about how wild that is. It's almost like the idea of how language works, that the baby's able to learn in any direction in the language. That's kind of an example of, it's not really perceptual. The perceptual part, it would be perceptual narrowing to the extent that language is perceptual. And which there's a huge perception aspect of every aspect of language. I should have just read the next sentence. I have that this domain-specific process is seen as important for language, and being able to understand things like music. Interesting perceptual narrowing, a sharpening of the system. It's like the language metaphor is like maybe the baby's born able to theoretically hear any language, but if they want to learn how to be as efficient as possible in English, it actually means narrowing what is accepted in terms of this narrowing filter of what English is and what it isn't, therefore. Okay, so let's talk about hearing for a second. So auditory experience begins during the last 2 months of pregnancy. Pretty interesting, eh? And so by the last 2 months of pregnancy, I'm kind of just saying the same thing backwards, but it is pretty wild to think that in those last 2 months, part of the sensory motor development that the baby's about starting to get into, this brain is being influenced by sound that it's hearing. It's become part of the processing system. By immediately after birth, infants cannot hear soft sounds quite as well, and things need to be louder for them to hear it, but this is going to be something that's going to be developing at a continual pace till about 10. By 3 months of age, infants' perception of sound improves, although some aspects of perception do not reach adult levels until like 10 years old or so. Infants are also less sensitive to the pitch. Pitch is the frequency of the sound, right? So it's like literally if you view sound as an audio distortion as a wave, right? Meaning like a high frequency sound, the wave would be up and down like a Richter scale, like an earthquake. And a less frequency. Frequency literally means how many times it's going up, right? So high frequency. Pitch is the frequency of a sound. A soprano's voice is high pitched. A bass is low pitched. Infants are less sensitive to low pitched sound and are more likely to hear a high pitched sound. By 2 years of age, infants have considerably improved their ability to distinguish sounds with different pitch. The ability to localize sound, so to know where the sound's coming from, like, oh, that sound's from behind me, or that one's from my left or from my right. That doesn't really get to kind of like your level until 2. So by the time the child's 2, like, if when Evie was 2, and if she was on the other side of that chair, and she had a blindfold on or whatever, and I either stood on like that side of the room or this side of the room and said, Evie, where am I? She'd be able to point. That'd be super easy to her. So this brings up this next idea called intermodal. I said that weird. intermodal. So think of a modal as like just a kind of weird way to say model or mode, different mode of doing things. That there's this like, well, there's the 5 different kind of acknowledged senses, right? Sixth sense, yeah, kind of being balance and coordination in the inner ear. And there's other senses, like your skin's ability to sense temperature, pressure. But and those are all sort of under the realm of touch. But so there's these 5 senses, but you know that, like, okay, say your grandma made amazing apple pie. It's like part of that memory to you is the vision, part of it's the smell, part of it's the taste. So even in that example, that's 3 of your senses, and the idea is that things affect you not in 3 ways there, it's in 1 way, but it's engaging those 3 systems in this intermodal perception, right? Even though it's engaging these 3 sensory systems, the perception is combined. It's integrating this information from 2 or more sensory modalities. It's a fancy way of saying, you like info from your ears and your eyes and your taste buds. But your perception of it is, oh, this is this pie I love, right? So it's like, and your perception of it might not even be put to words, right? Especially if we're talking about during infancy. So their world is this connection of the senses. It's so fascinating, really, to think that a baby's world is like a connection of their sensory experiences and moving around, and that's actually building their brain. It's actually what the nurtures, well, it's their interaction with their physical world, their earliest interaction with their physical world. So the greatest, or definitely the most famous developmental psychologist of all time, Piaget, Jean Piaget, he had this really groundbreaking idea that actually we are constantly playing out our map of the world, and we have this and it's why it's like in sports it's a good example where maybe after a game it's like, oh, that game plan didn't work, back to the drawing board, let's make a new plan, let's try that new plan out in the next game. And the idea is that we're almost, without articulating it that way, we're almost doing that in life in general. And there's this process of creating an understanding, a scheme, a plan, a operationalized map of what our world is, and that we're constantly bringing that map into the world. He called this process of bringing it into the world assimilation. So where we have this idea of how the world is, and we're trying to use that to understand things and assimilate those things into our understanding. So his idea was that you have this view of how the world is, and then you go out and you engage your world and you're making sense of it. And sometimes, so assimilation, children use their existing understanding of the world to deal with new information. And so the new things that you learn aren't just randomly interpreted, they're interpreted within your worldview, perception, whatever word we want to use, we're calling it here, your schema, your mental organization of information, how you're making sense of your world. It's not really your worldview as much as how you're making sense of your worldview. And then as that's happening, you run into new information. Some information maybe supports what you're doing, some maybe challenges it. So Piaget has these dual concepts of assimilation and accommodation, right? And you probably know what the word accommodate means. It's like, oh, this doesn't work for me, I need to accommodate it by I don't know, it gets cold in the Canadian winters, you accommodate that by wearing additional clothing at the parts of your body where you lose heat, for a bald guy like me, especially the head, right? So wearing a toque in the winter is important, and that's an accommodation to the environment. So accommodation means when you kind of adapt your game plan based on new information. And the idea is that we're constantly doing that, and that's basically how the brain develops. When we say that you get smarter throughout life, we're just saying that that game plan is getting stronger, more complex, more able to deal with randomness. And ability to deal with randomness is what we call generalizable. It's not domain specific. It's actually able to work in a general way. Right, which is why, again, another link to artificial intelligence, and why in artificial intelligence, their like holy grail, their goal is to create generalized intelligence, right? Not intelligence that can beat you at chess or at Mario Brothers 3, but an intelligence that can beat you at any game. And because it can use its ability to think to play different games the same way you can. It's not just trained on one game, which we would call like domain specific, or what they call narrow AI. Almost everything's narrow AI. Like your GPS is narrow AI. Your GPS doesn't know what it's doing, but it's better at directions than any human being ever has been. Your calculator doesn't know what it's doing. It's the world's best mathematician. Infants not only perceive sound and visual patterns, they also develop an understanding of how objects and people work. To navigate their world, babies must learn that objects exist even when out of view, that objects fall if they're not being supported, that objects can be put into categories, that people have goals, that some people are good, that some people are mean. Piaget's theory is general, a unifying story of how biology and experience sculpt cognitive development. The Swiss child psychologist Jean Piaget thought that just as our physical bodies had structures that enable us to adapt to the world, we build mental structures that help us adapt to the world also, and that adaptation involves adjusting to new environmental demands. Piaget stressed that children actively construct their own cognitive worlds, that information is not just poured into their minds from the environment. He sought to discover how children at different points in their development think about the world, and how systematic changes in their thinking occurs. So Piaget argued that individuals go through these 4 stages of development. Now, I really want you to kind of step outside of just being able to, like you've heard this before, you took an intro to psych class. You could maybe even tell me what the 4 are. The point, though, that I really want to hammer is that it's qualitative changes. It's completely different ways of thinking. His idea is groundbreaking because he's saying kids don't just get better at doing things. They're using whole different systems. They're almost like playing video games on entirely different consoles. They have these different levels, these different stages of cognitive development, but we're going to be talking specifically about cognitive development, and that's actually a result of this process of you playing your maps out against the world. And that they're different qualitatively, not just like it's not like it's just a more or less of the same thing. They're completely different things. Their differences not at a level of quantitative, it's at the level of quality, actual essence. So this brings us to one of the most interesting, often taught, and underhyped aspects of psychology that I think people don't, and even myself, it took me a while to sort of realize how deep of an idea this is. That early brain development from birth to 2 is basically being initiated through this engagement of movement and sensation, right? Motor just means movement, the motor system, right? And then sensory means like what we've been talking about all day with sensation. At the beginning of the sensory motor stage, newborns have little more than reflexes to work with. By the end of the sensory motor stage, 2-year-olds can produce complex sensory motor patterns and start to use primitive symbols, even in the beginning of speech. Piaget observed infants' reaction when interesting objects disappeared. If the infants searched for the object, it was inferred that they knew it continued to exist. Whereas 9-month-olds search for hidden objects, younger infants don't. So Piaget was like interested at this idea that kids under a certain age didn't even look for things anymore when they were gone. We're going to use this term later, object permanence, or this idea that like this room that I'm presenting in exists between videos. You all know that. Charlotte doesn't know that, my 9-week-old. You know, if I set her down on the bed and step around the corner, to her I just disappeared. I just left existence. I'm not a permanent object. And that idea that the world is permanent even when we're not immediately looking at it, that's just a level of cognitive ability that's not accessible yet to my 9-week-old. According to Piaget, the crowning achievement of the sensory motor experience is object permanence. The understanding that objects continue to exist when they cannot be seen, heard, or touched. That you live in a permanent, that there's an objective reality that you're living in. Object permanence. So I want to talk here about this idea that these layers of cognitive development, then, that we're sort of talking about conditioning or learning, and we're talking about attention and how attention plays this huge role, and how, because attention is like, if we're talking about this developing cognitive system, attention is what it's looking at, or listening to, or tasting, right? What's it aiming at? And you've heard me rant on this before, but that we're target-facing creatures. Infants can learn through operant conditioning. If an infant's behavior is influenced by the probability of the behavior's reoccurrence, infants can learn through operant conditioning, basically through this idea of like rewards and punishments, like we've talked about. That this can even affect things like how the baby smiles, and the parent smiles back, and that feels good to the baby, so they smile more. It's like, that's an example of operant conditioning, actually. Attention, the focusing of mental resources. That's an interesting definition of attention. The focusing of mental resources on selected information. And that this improves cognitive processing on many tasks. Even newborns can detect a contour, like a bump, and fix their attention to it. Older infants can scan patterns more thoroughly. By 4 months, infants can selectively attend to objects. Individual differences in attention during infancy can be predictive of differences in cognitive functioning later in life. Right? So being able to pay attention is important, because everything you're going to learn is shaped by how psychologically involved you are at the point of learning. And that's heavily influenced by attention. Another aspect of attention that plays an important role in development is this idea of joint attention. And this is the idea of like, so if you wanted to see, it's weird because I kind of give a point about joint attention there instead of the definition. You could say joint attention's definition is two people focusing on the same thing, like they're joined. It's a joint attention. So joint attention would be like my daughter playing house with another kid, and they're both playing the same game. They're not parallel playing beside each other. They have a combined attention, a joint attention, you'd say. So this joint attention idea in infancy, right, kind of being in the same mind space, involves the ability to track each other's behavior, such as following what someone's looking at, like noticing that, like, I come over, like the one kid comes over and sits with the other kid and notices that the other kid's looking down at these toys and looking at this, and so part of this kid that's coming second's ability to join in is linked to their ability to follow the eyes. Because again, I just made this point on the last slide about how we're target-based creatures, whether we focus on that or not. It's like, we know that what we're looking at has meaning, which is why lots of kids think parents are obsessed with their phones, because it looks like we are. And that's why at night or something, if I'm reading a book, even if I have books on my phone, I try to read like an actual book, because I don't know, it's just different. It's just different to the kid, to Evelyn. Sort of interesting. This idea that early in infancy, joint attention usually involves a caregiver pointing or using words to direct an infant's attention. Emerging forms of joint attention occur at about 7 to 8 months, but it's not until about 10 or 11 months that joint attention skills are frequently start to be observed. By the first birthday, infants have begun to direct adults' attention to objects, like, look at this, oh, this is funny, can you notice this? And it's starting to become a little bit more, the point here is sort of a little bit more of a shared experience. Joint play is sort of an example I was speaking to earlier. So it's this idea of, well, there's the developing cognitive world of the child, and it's that world is bouncing off other developing cognitive worlds, right? And that's part of that, those cognitive worlds' individual development. So joint attention requires three things: the ability to track each other's behavior, such as following a gaze, the ability to one person to sort of be leading and the other one following, and then the fact that it's back and forth, reciprocal. And I wanted to show this because you obviously know what memory is. Memory is the retention of information over time, sometimes for a few seconds, sometimes for a lifetime. Positioning a discussion of memory here is important, though, because the formation of the mind and the formation of the memory process that facilitates the mind's function, because memory is such a core part of what we call your cognitive experience. And what I wanted to kind of highlight here is these ideas of implicit and explicit memory, right? That there's certain things that are explicit memories, like your memories of your vacations, your memories of your first date, your memories of, I don't know, your worst day at work or whatever. It's like those are things that you can think of. It's your conscious memory of facts and experiences. But there's also things like how you shift weight between legs when walking downstairs, right? How you position your elbow to catch a ball that's coming towards your face. It's like all these things that are like we sort of put under this broader category of muscle memory, or just kind of it's been internalized learning, this implicit memory. When you say muscle memory, yeah, you mean that like the eye sees it and it makes the body do it, but you can say that's eye-hand coordination. But when you're saying muscle memory, what do you mean when you're using the word memory in that context? It's like that it's been embodied and internalized so deeply that it's not something that's involved with a conscious thought process. And that a lot of, and this might be a link to the idea that we don't remember so much from these first few years, is that a lot of our memory development during that time is happening at an implicit level. In this, because you can see how routine procedures and skills is related to this idea of the sensory motor period. So I thought that you might find this idea kind of interesting, and I want to go on another point on this, like the idea that it's sometimes called infantile or childhood amnesia, or the idea that you don't remember very much of the first few years. And there's different ideas to why that can be, and some of it's because of the developing complexity, and some of it's because of frame of reference. It's hard to remember things when you don't have a system of where to place those in relation to other things. But there's also situations like the prefrontal lobes are believed to play an important part of storing memories, especially memories related to specific episodic memories, so like memories related to events. And that part of the brain is still pretty immature in the first 2 years. By the time we get to the second year of life, though, we start to see more people reporting, and this is all just from asking people, right? Like more people report memories from once they get past 2. Okay, so as the child's getting more, as their cognitive world's getting more complex and nuanced, and they're starting to form concepts, and so concepts, this idea of being able to start to group things, and they're starting to be able to understand things, and the early conceptualization of the world is linked to their early abilities to start to group objects that are similar and events that are similar, and these are people, and start to have ideas, and their conceptual aspect or their conceptual understanding is growing and growing, and that this conceptual understanding is key to their cognitive development. They're starting to have ideas about what things are and who people are and how things are related to each other. And even though these conceptual understandings are limited and beginner, they're key developmentally. Without these concepts, each object or event would seem unique. It would seem unplaceable. It wouldn't have a place on the map that it fit in this larger story that's making sense, this larger Piagetian schema. You'd be unable to make generalizations. Young infants form these categories, but the nature of these categories change throughout infancy. Right? And we call this perceptual categorization. They're starting to know, like, okay, these are things that are toys. These are things that are kitchen stuff. These are things that are outside toys. These are things that are mummies. These are things that are daddies. This is all this being able to see things in how they fit into categories. This early perceptual categorization. Okay, so the term I want you to have here, perceptual categorization. So for this one, you know, you don't really have to write the first point, but I'd like you to get that second term, infinite generativity. Is, first of all, that's a cool term because it means that once you take words, or once you basically have an alphabet that can put spellings to sounds, and you have this vocal system that can make this incredible range of tones and pitches and sounds, basically, that we have this endless ability, this infinite generativity, this ability to produce endless numbers of meaningful sentences using even what may be a somewhat limited amount of actual words, right? Like well, in English there's thousands and thousands of words. We actually tend to repeat a few hundred words, but there's all these words that we have this kind of infinite generativity, this infinite ability to generate new, people could write books. Everybody could be writing a book every day until the end of time, and if you could think of creative enough ideas, like you could keep making sentences that make sense. It's like this playground for the mind that's infinitely generative. That language gives us this ability to produce an endless number of sentences, and the meaningfulness or the profoundness of how meaningful they are is obviously going to differ, but that there's this substructure that exists that allows the use of language as this incredible functioning communicative tool. So what's interesting is that all around the world we see certain commonalities, and it seems to kind of go in this progression of the kind of first visual, or not visual, but the first auditory expression the child has is crying, obviously, and then you start to see this cooing or gurgling. I should actually record my child and show you it, because my child's at that stage right now where it's like she's like starting to make sounds, right? That's called cooing. Or eventually she's going to get to the point of babbling, where she starts to like play with, she's not saying word, that kind of goo goo gaga kind of thing, where she's like starting to play with syllables, starting to point at things. That pointing seems to be really associated. And again, what have I been saying this whole course? We're target facing creatures. It's like, what's pointing? It's just showing you what my target is. Hey, look at what my target is. And that a lack of that is actually a concern. So I've mentioned this a few times, but this is pretty interesting, right? That before learning words, infants are making these distinctions in what they're hearing in their environment. They're starting to discriminate auditory stimulus. Before learning words, infants can make distinctions amongst the language, the sounds in a language, and even what is a language they understand and which one isn't. This is interesting. I got some interesting stories I'll talk about throughout this course when we're talking about language, because there's kind of a part of my wife's family that has a real French. There's a French part of my wife's family, so like some of my kids' cousins speak primarily French, which is, but around here, like, because my wife's sister's husband is from like up near Quebec, like the northernest parts of Ontario that are touching near Quebec, and so grew up French. And so it's just interesting because some of the kids that my daughter plays with speak both French and English, so I've got to see how sort of their language development in a bilingual home is just interesting. It's additionally interesting because there's also this idea of they're trying to understand sort of two knowledge systems at the same time and how they interact, and when one's one, not the other one. And they start to get better at that. Long before they begin to use words, infants can make fine distinctions amongst the language of sounds. Patricia Kuhl's research on phonemes, which are like the basic sound units of a language, from languages all over the world, are piped through a speaker for infants to hear. Kuhn then uses operant conditioning to see whether infants can discriminate the different phonemes universally, so if they can notice the difference. A box with a toy bear is placed where an infant can see it. A string of identical syllables is played and periodically the symbols are changed. Ba ba ba, pa pa pa. If the infant turns its head when the symbols change, the box lights up and the bear dances and drums, rewarding the infant for noticing that change. Kuhl's research has demonstrated that from birth to about 6 months, infants are citizens of the world. They can tell when sounds change most of the time, no matter what language a syllable comes from. But over the next 6 months, infants growing up in monolingual environments, so just an environment where they're only exposed to one English, like one environment, like say my kids being exposed only to English. Infants growing up in a monolingual environment get even better at perceiving changes in sounds of their own language, the ones their parent speaks, and gradually lose the ability to recognize differences that are not important to their own language. So notice that discrimination is actually, you'd say in this case, getting better. They're better able to notice when it's their language, when it's not. Their ability to distinguish between words in their own language is getting better. Their ability to process the other in any way is getting worse. We called that earlier in this lecture, we called that perceptual narrowing. Okay, so segmentation. So think about segments as like a segment of a sentence is like a part of a sentence. So it's like before a baby starts to get to talk in full sentences, they're starting to, the real challenge in learning a language is starting to make these little parts of sentences, like say more than just a word, but start to actually talk. And that starting to actually talk is this process of segmentation, right? Taking segments and putting them together. The real challenge in language learning is segmentation. That it can be difficult to segment continuous streams of speech into words. Babies likely solve problems of segmentation by relying on the should I start this slide over? This is my fourth try at this. The co-occurrent patterns of phenoms and symbols, extracting potential word forms, right? So it's like part of it is that if I was to show you Charlotte, say if you came to Kitchener to go shopping at Fairview Mall or something, and I just happened to be there, even though I never go to malls, but say I was there, and me and Charlotte are like, actually I do sometimes go to stores because Evie loves it, so it'd be more likely that I'd be with my 5-year-old, and we're at a store and all of a sudden we see you. You're not gonna, again, I switched my kid and I messed up my example. Let's go back to I'm there with Charlotte, right? So I'm there with the baby. And you come in and I'm like, oh, hey, this is my baby Charlotte. You're not going to be like, so what do you think about the most recent politics? You're probably going to be like, oh, hi. And you're probably going to actually get lower. You're probably going to open up. You're probably going to lean a bit before. Your face will get softer. You'll start to spread out your vowel use. Hi, how's it going? And you might not even notice, but you're making your O's and your I's and your A's and your E's longer. You're actually teaching my kid how to talk without even knowing it. That's what adults do with this way of speaking, in a way that you're showing the segments of how words and language work. You're modeling. And that here's another part I want you to have is there's a difference between receptive vocabulary and spoken vocabulary. And people with kids, you know this, that like there's things that your kid understands that they can't say. So their receptive vocabulary is always higher. The kid can understand a lot more than they can say. So I'll just kill my camera here so you can see this graph better. So this is looking at this idea of receptive and spoken vocabulary, and children often express various intentions with single words like water instead of, can you please get me a glass of water? It's like just the really blunt demand. As they get, so the first word, sometimes comes around 9 months to a year, it can go as long to a year and a half. And then there's the green there is representing this major vocabulary spurt that happens. This huge kind of jump in language that can be anywhere from like a little bit less than a year and a half old to a little bit over 2. For the test, I'm not going to like ask too specific questions about those age ranges because it is so fluid. And so this is this idea of telegraphic speech, right? To telegraph, to like, well, think of a telegraph would be to this idea of like using a shorter, precise words without grammatical markers, just saying. Well, I have here written down, in every language, a child's first combination of words tend to have this economical quality. So think about economical meaning as like words are almost expensive. They're using the words that are most important. They're saying milk, water, toy. They're not using any filler words. 18 to, so a year and a half to 2 years, usually kids start to produce 2-word utterances, so start to put things together like me, water. Children at this stage are still relying heavily on things like gestures, like pointing, the tone that they're using, like that when they're upset or when they're happy, the context of the situation. And it's interesting that even though these 2-word utterances may leave out words, they seem across languages to be quite efficient signals. In every language, children's first word combinations have this economical quality, like I was mentioning. Babies have to solve their problem of segmentation during this first year of life. Initially, they likely rely on statistical information, such as, again, not like they know that they're doing this, their brain, their processor, is probably looking at how often certain patterns are occurring, certain phonemes, certain syllables, and which allows them to extract potential word forms. As infants extract an increasing number of potential word forms from the speech they stream as they're hearing, they begin to associate these with concrete, perceptually available objects in their world. Telegraphic speech, then, is this use of short, precise words without grammatical markers. To convey meaning with limited words, the child relies heavily on linking those words with these things we've been talking about, like gestures and tones and context. We look at some of this here. It's like kind of an interesting chart, looking at some of these language milestones like birth, the crying, and then the cooing kind of beginning around 2 to 4 months, and then around 5 months the first word is likely to start to anywhere around from there. We had just said it could go as late as to 2 years. By 6 months we start to see the baby starting to babble, starting to get more language specific as it's getting closer to a year, starting to use more gestures. By 13 months or so, maybe using a first word. By a year and a half, we're starting to see them at least understand receptive wise, being able to use this expanded vocabulary. By 2 years, starting to get into these 2-word utterances, this rapid expansion in understanding. So the Broca and the Wernicke's areas of the brain we're going to look at for a second, because these are both involved in language. The Broca's area is involved in producing words. So this is sort of interesting, right? So it's like the purple part of that little girl's brain in that image is related to producing words, to thinking of the words to say to speech. Whereas the Wernicke's area is the region of the brain in the left hemisphere used in language comprehension. So it's interesting, like the part of the brain that's producing language and the part of the brain that's understanding language spoke to you are different. And these two parts of the brain, so if you could have that idea that the Broca's area is related to producing words and the Wernicke's area is related to understanding the speech of others, but that those two things are dynamically involved in your processing language, right? Because if it's like your use of language is basically those two things, your ability to understand what I'm saying to you and your ability to talk back to me. Another one of the reasons why we know that this can be, or that these reasons, and this is true with a lot of things about the brain, is sometimes why we know certain areas, at least historically, how they've known that certain areas are related to other, or to certain functions, is when people have very specific brain injuries and then have impairments in those areas. And this aphasia, or this loss of language processing, can be associated with damage to either the Broca or the Wernicke's areas. So when the Broca's area is injured, so this is kind of interesting, right? If there's an injury to that area, it tends to result in difficulty in speaking, but not understanding, which is exactly what we would think, because that's the area that's related to production, not comprehension. And when there's injuries to the Wernicke area, there can be poor comprehension. The person can still talk, but the speech can get more nonsensical, right? Less comprehension based. The person can sort of make less sense, or whatever we mean when we say that. The part that's informing the actual use and selection of words seems to be impaired. So it's quite interesting how we kind of see the function and when the function becomes impaired. And that's true with a lot of things with the brain. The ability to speak and understand language requires a certain vocal apparatus, as well as a nervous system with specific capabilities. The nervous system and vocal apparatus of humans' predecessors changed over hundreds of thousands or millions of years. With advances in the nervous system and vocal structures, Homo sapiens speech developed. Although estimates vary, some experts believe that humans acquired language about 100,000 years ago, which in evolutionary time represents a very recent acquisition. It gave us humans an enormous edge over other animals and increased the chances of human survival. To great Noam Chomsky, the human being is a language acquisition device. That you have this pre-wiring in you to learn a language, at a certain time and in a certain way. Chomsky said that children are born into the world with this LED and this biological endowment, this biological gift from your ancestors, this ability to use language as a tool, to detect the various features and rules of language, this computer that's trained to do it. Chomsky's language acquisition device is obviously a theoretical construct, not a physical part of the brain, but supporters of this idea cite the uniformity in language milestones across languages and cultures, evidence that children create language even in the absence of well-formed input, and that biological underpinnings of language seem to have similarity. Critics argue that, although it's an interesting idea, it doesn't explain the full process of language acquisition. Okay, so let's fire through. We're going to do rapid fire kind of chapter summary for these ones that you're doing quizzes on. Okay, we spent today talking about this idea. Started off about the last video, the idea of cephalocautal and proximodistal as meaning this idea of cephalocautal head to tail and proximodistal center to outside, and that growth kind of tends to happen biophysically around these two, and also functionally along these two kind of ways of viewing it. The physical growth is rapid in the first year of life, but slows down in the second. That dramatic changes characteristic in brain development in the first 2 years. And during this first 2 years that we're seeing the neurons in the brain are being born and synapses are formed and pruned and these major structures are emerging. And we looked at all of that. We looked at this neuroconstructive view, right? That your brain is being constructed through your experiences with your world. And that's where I showed that Lex Freeman clip. Sleep patterns are correlated to cognitive development. We talked about this important role that sleep plays. We talked about this concept of reflexes or automatic movement, unlearned behavior. The fact that there's these automatic movements, and what does even automatic movement mean? What's an unlearned behavior? These reflexes that govern newborns' behaviors. Then we talked about Arnold Giselle and his idea of a dynamic system theory, that motor skills develop when babies are motivated to act, and it's this dynamic exchange with who they are genetically and what their environment is motivating them to, how their environment's motivating them to engage. They move their arm because there's a toy that they want, and the toy that they want is an important part of learning the functionality of moving the arm. Right? We talked about these emerging gross and fine motor skills, gross meaning big, fine motor meaning small, right? Sorry, that last point I was just saying. Gross motor skills meaning big things like crawling, walking, sitting up. Fine motor skills meaning obviously smaller things like holding a pen or picking up something fine. Sensation occurs when information acts with the sensory receptors. All right, you're like, okay, Mike, don't go on another rant about that. I was talking about that like all day. Perception is the interpretation of that. Visual acuity or sharpness, depth perception improved throughout infancy. We talked about this idea of intermodal perception sharpens. This, as the child's getting older, their ability to combine their senses and their perception, so their ability to integrate basically sound, sight, and their different sensations into their perceptual read of their world gets stronger. Nature and nurture interacts in this perceptual development. Some of it seems to be being triggered from the outside world. Some of it seems to be triggered by this pre-programmed genetics. And last page of points. Piaget had this idea that children construct their own cognitive world, that they build these mental structures to adapt to their world. Right? These schemas, we talked about assimilation, accommodation. Piaget argued that babies don't really understand this idea that objects are permanent until about 9 months, which is why peekaboo works on young kids, but as they get closer to a year, it stops working because they realize, like, if I just pulled Dad's hands down, he's still there. He's not coming in and out of the matrix of reality. But to a younger kid, it seems like, mom's disappearing and reappearing. Now, this idea of object permanence, I just wanted to add, has been a bit challenged lately, and some recent research suggests that babies may understand object permanence earlier and may be born with certain types of knowledge. Again, it's complicated to get into what that would even mean. What do you mean born with knowledge? That's actually that's a massive claim. This idea that social cognition develops in infancy, right? That right from infancy, the develop of the social mind is inseparable from the social world. Thanks for watching. Don't be too stressed about the test, okay? Just go over, if you took some notes, go over the notes a couple times. If you watch these videos, you're probably ready to rock. All right, you get 2 chances on the test. I'm gonna keep your higher score. It's that respondus lockdown, which is a bit of a bummer, but again, I'm teaching your class from like 10 hours away, so I gotta use some technology to help with the test monitoring. It is what it is, I guess, but if you look around on this channel, you can see anyways, basically I just feel bad that I have to use that on you, but once the students last year, once they kind of got the hang of it, it was no big deal, and they found the test pretty fair and straightforward. So I hope that you have the same experience. So what I would actually recommend is, if you've never used Respondus Lockdown, I'm going to put a couple practice test opportunities. Do those so that you kind of learn how to use the system, so you're not like the computer part of it's out of the way. Then look over your notes and then just do the first quiz. And by the time you've done the first quiz, you'll sort of learn the whole system. And then quiz 2, 3, 4, and 5 won't be as big a deal. I really tried with this class to make the tests smaller and focused on chapters, so that this whole course isn't just about your evaluations. You're going to do these 2 projects, which I'm really looking forward to looking at what you've been working on. And then you're going to do these little chapter quizzes. We're not going to have a final exam. All right, we're going to do school the right way. Who needs a final exam? Hope you have a great week. You're a great group of people. Take care of your loved ones, and thanks for watching. See you soon.